My name's Miles Giller, and I was born and bred in North Canterbury, and like a lot of people in North Canterbury, I spent quite a bit of time up in the hills, and both working and in recreation. And quite a bit of that time was spent with Nick Ledgard here. Now, Nick's taught me an awful lot over the years, but one of the things he's specialised in is wilding conifers. And 25 years ago, I really didn't know what a wilding conifer was, but nowadays I am very aware of what wilding conifers are, and I think a lot of people here would be very aware as well. And a lot of that's down to the work of Nick Ledgard. So Nick, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be familiar with wilding conifers?
Yeah, sure, Miles. My background has been with the Forest Service. I joined them as a trainee when I left school, and still with them now really, working their research arm, which is the Forest Research Institute, but we trade these days under the name SCION, so that's where the SCION comes from. I've spent most of my time in the high country looking at tree growing up there, and I've worked from Molesworth right through to Queenstown, and we have in that country excellent tree growing environment. And when a survey we did some years ago, we found tree growth of world record proportions of introduced trees in that high country. But I realised then that if we were going to realise that potential for that growth, we had to be aware of the problems too. And that same survey, I saw wilding spread going on, and so we started doing research on that 25 years ago. And I spend more time these days doing work on wildings than I do on any other thing.
So what really is a wilding tree?
Well, this is a wilding tree, this one here. A wilding tree is the natural regeneration of an introduced tree, particularly conifers, particularly pines, larches, firs, etc. Whereas most trees are planted, this one has grown from seed. The tree up in the high country has produced seed, and it has blown with the wind, produced this seedling, and I can tell it's a wilding because it's got a straight root. If that had been in the nursery, it would have had to have been cut here, and it would have a much more bunched root, whereas this one's got a very straight tree. So that's one I collected from the hills just last weekend.
So it's a nice looking tree, Nick, and I know whenever I go up the hills, I just love to sit under a nice tree and have my lunch in the shade, so why would this tree be a problem?
Well, that's a wilding tree. And the trouble is with wilding trees that they move about the country. We plant trees where we want them, and if they stay there, there's no problem. But these ones are very successful in producing the likes of cones, such as this, and seed, and then that seed blows and goes to areas where they're not wanted. And the reason why they're not wanted, it's a bit like sheep. The sheep on one side of the farmer's fence is a prospect. On the other side, that wild sheep is a nuisance. It's a problem. And it's the same with these. As you can see, this tree here is 3, 1, 2, 3, probably 4 years old from seed, if you hold that, Miles. Mm-hmm. And it's upright and it's very dark in colour. Whereas the sort of country that we're looking at up there, this is in the Mackenzie Basin, mostly you've got these pastoral, short stature grasses, etc. These are conifers in the front here, and you can see how obvious they are. So when this starts spreading over that country, the traditional scene changes from one of pastel colours to one of dark green, vigorous, upright, and people don't really like that. In addition, these trees here, if growing tall like where they're growing in this particular spot, they'll submerge any native vegetation that's underneath. So we've got a threat to conservation values. And the other one is that if that land wanted to be changed towards a pastoral use or another deliberate tree, you've got an extra cost of removing these to get that new crop on the land. So those are three aspects why wilding trees aren't wanted. There's a lot of money being spent on removing them.
I'm aware that a lot of the high country, Nick, used to be clad in forest once upon a time before mankind came to New Zealand, and we see the natural forest, native forest coming back in places, and yet these things seem to be doing it so much more successfully. Why would that be?
Now that's the sort of question that a lot of overseas people ask. New Zealanders don't ask it because we're used to seeing, like we look at Hagley Park out here, and every tree we see out there is introduced tree. It's not natives. And there's a reason for that. And foreigners come into the country and they say, we've got these native trees that have evolved here, why aren't you using them? And the simple reason for that is that our flora developed in isolation not so long ago by world terms. And they developed on quite a small archipelago of islands, which were quite temperate climate, so there wasn't a great range of species, and it was relatively mild by what it is today. So that when you come to today's situation and we're looking for trees for harsh sites like we are in places like that photo I showed you, our flora really lacks that hardy, cold, drought-tolerant element that you get in the northern hemisphere, where trees up there have evolved over a much longer period, large areas, a greater mixing of genes and proving of survival of the fittest, and of course harsher conditions, so they're more cold and drought tolerant. And that is why this thing here will grow above our natural tree line. Our native beech stops, say here, and the conifers will grow higher. Whether we like it or not, I'm afraid, introduce trees more hardy for a lot of our particularly harsh conditions than our native flora.
I noticed you bought quite a few cones along, Nick, so I'm assuming there's quite a few culprits in the mix here. Are all conifers a problem?
No, far from it. Every time I drive south through the Mackenzie Basin, along the road there, I'm seeing trees alongside all the farmsteads, and they're all introduced conifers, and a lot of those are not spreading because of the circumstances that they're growing in, and so some species do and some don't. This fellow here, everybody likes this one. That's the big cone pine, has a big heavy seed. In fact, there might even be some in there. Yep, there are a few in there. And that is a heavy seed, as you can see, and that doesn't spread. I've never seen a natural regeneration of this species. And it's the same with the other bigger cones. By and large, they don't spread a lot. But once we get to these smaller ones, things like this is contorta pine, Scots pine, Corsican pine, lighter seed, blows further, and those are the ones that are generally the wilding problem.
No, it's interesting about the seed, Nick. It's got a big wing on it. What does that mean for you?
Well, that allows it to be picked up by the wind and blown a long distance, as opposed to a lot of our natives which don't have that wing on. Mountain beech, for example, only go 20-odd metres. That thing, not that big one, but if we had a smaller version, as in these small cones, they can blow many kilometres. Not often, but they can be blown many kilometres.
So in terms of a problem, just how much of New Zealand is affected by wilding conifers, Nick?
It's not such a problem in the North Island. You've got moisture conditions there. You've got a lot of different, more vigorous growth. So the opportunity for spread, that open country that I showed you before, doesn't exist so much there. South Island, particularly in the eastern areas, there's a lot of it. We reckon the high country, depending on your definition, is 3.5, 5 million hectares. And the area affected by wildings, depends what you mean by affected. Is it one tree every square metres? Is it one of these every hectare? But if it's one tree every 5 hectares, we say that's affected by wildings. Probably about 600,000 hectares affected by wildings in the South Island.
It's a big area. I know just recently I was up in the Kaweka Ranges, which is just east of Lake Taupo, and even well above the bushline there, one was able to see the odd stump where they had been cut off, but there were also the odd seedling just scattered around here and there.
Sure, that's the North Island, which I say is not such a big issue, but the place you talk about, the Kawekas, that's mostly this little fellow here, contorta pine, and that was grown there or planted and sown there for erosion control reasons. Central Plateau, a lot of wildings around that country, mostly under control now, but that's where the word wilding was almost coined. They were the first onto it in the Central Plateau of the North Island.
Yep. And recently I was up around the Waia district, east of Hanmer, up in North Canterbury there, and it was quite interesting just to see on some of the hillsides there would be just a pine here, another one there, another one there, just sometimes over a kilometre apart, but just in the middle of nowhere. Where did they all come from?
Well, those ones up there, I know the area you talk about. We've done a bit of hunting up there, Miles, after all, haven't we? It was this one here. It's Corsican pine. And they actually have come from Hanmer Forest, which is, 15 kilometres further to the northwest?
I would imagine,
yeah. And so in that particular situation, it was a plantation, planted about 100 years ago, and they first started turning up in the area you're talking about the 1940s. But you're only seeing the odd one, because that long-distant carriage of seed only occurs usually about every 10, 20 years, where seed will fall locally frequently, but the long-distance spread is much more infrequent. It doesn't happen regularly. And we can tell that because we can age these trees. 1, 2, 3, 4, we know exactly that tree arrived on that site 4 years ago.
Yep.
So by aging them, we can tell when they arrived.
So if I was to cut down any wilding trees and count the number of rings and get the age, it would probably correspond to a big wind event or something like that.
Well, you're right, because as the Hanmer one, the one that actually went from Hanmer into Molesworth, coincides nicely with the 67 Wahine storm, and it coincides nicely with that storm going through, strong storm at the right time of the year when seed was falling, and took it north into Molesworth Station.
And I noticed in the papers there's a field day coming up, I think it's tomorrow, up to Craigieburn, looking at wilding trees.
That's
Tell us
right.
a bit about that, man.
There is, up to Craigieburn, and they're trying to control contorta pine. That's an area which I know well, because I planted half the trees that are spreading up there. But we won't go into that. But most people would be familiar with that, where they're spreading over the main road there, heading up to Arthur's Pass. And if we head further south, talking about roads, we've got the road that goes up to Mount Cook. And there at the start of it, there's a lot of contorta pine spreading to the extent that it's not only submerging farmland, it's also blocking off tourist views across the lake and up to Mount Cook. And there's a plan underway there, both there and in the Flock Hill one, to control that. And just to take one more, if we go to our icon tourist town, Queenstown, the back of Queenstown is covered with wilding Douglas fir. And people wouldn't want to change that. It's the backdrop they're familiar with. And they were there, stopped rocks rolling down the hill, avalanches, etc. But if you look across to the other side of the lake, Cecil, Walter Peak, and the Remarkables, they have no trees on them, and that would really change that scenery. Wildings are getting there, and they're removing them now, but most people do not want that to change. So okay here, but not wanted over there.
So notice some of the pictures over the back in the displays here, Nick, even had conifers looking up at Mount Cook, so some people like them.
Oh yes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Miles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we're wanting to control these conifers, Nick, are they going to be easy to control or not?
Well, if there's a lot, like where we're going up tomorrow to Flock Hill, no, it's a big job. But by and large, if we compared these things, we'll say, with gorse and broom, they're a lot easier to control. They're very obvious. Now that tree is 3 or 4 years old. This species will be at least 10 or 11. It'll be as tall as this tent before it starts coning. So we've got all that time to get rid of it. In addition, these things are very predictable. We know when they will produce cones, because they're very regular with that. We know where they'll go, because they have that seed with a wing on it that we had here before, and they're only dispersed by wind, and of course that'll go downwind, so we know what direction it'll go. And we also know that it won't establish in well-farmed land or well-vegetated land. They'll only establish in lightly vegetated, lightly grazed land. So if a thing is predictable, almost by definition, it's manageable. So yes, if we get onto them in time, that's what it's all about.
And what if I was a landowner in North Canterbury, and I wish I was, Nick, and I had a few pines coming up out on the rough slopes out the back, should I be worried about it? What should I be doing about it?
You should be trying to get rid of those lone trees you see before they cone. And it's all about that. And I'll give this cone to anybody out there that can work out what that means. So what does it mean, Miles? It means stitch in time saves 9. Sits 9, that's what wilding control is all about. If we can get out there, remove this before it seeds, then we're saving ourselves at least 9 times much more work than if we allowed it to seed. So that's almost the motto for wilding control. Sits 9, stitch in time saves 9.
And Nick, with your work, how are you helping landowners address this problem?
Well, 3 years ago I was asked to do some work for Molesworth Station, and the work on wildings. And that work I could see would not only be useful on Molesworth, but would be useful throughout the country. So we went and formed a group called the South Island Wilding Conifer Management Group, and that involves DOC, farmers, forest and bird, regional councils, district councils, forest companies, all the major people that are involved with or have problems with wildings. And the number one objective of that is promotion, awareness. Because if we can get farmers, particularly farmers, aware of what that means in terms of potential spread, if they know there's a problem, they'll work on it. If they don't know there's a problem, they won't. And a few years ago I went to a farmer's place that had a whole lot of trees about twice this size on his property, and he was They're a bit bigger actually, because the sheep used to get shade under them, and he used to have his lunch under them. And I said to him, now those trees are about 10 years old. Within 5 years, they will have a lot of spread around them. And he asked me to explain that further, which I did. A month later, they were gone. All those trees were gone. Once he realised there was a problem, fixed it. So awareness is number one. We're also looking at risk. And in these maps here, we just hold those up. This is some maps that we've produced. If you hold that up there, Miles, that map there, we've got Lake Coleridge up by your thumb, and all that pink shows areas that are susceptible to wilding spread. And that's worked out from the amount of grazing, the amount of vegetation cover there is there. So that's what's susceptible to wilding spread. It's a big area. But if we look at this one here, hold that alongside, same map, doesn't have half the pink on it. The reason for that is you won't get spread where there's no source. This one actually has the sources marked on it, so that's where you're liable to get the spread occurring down through here. So those are the areas that farmers would have to be particularly aware of. That's why we're right into prevention. A little book like that we've produced called Wilding Prevention. Because if we're aware of that, there's no risk of these spreading further into these other pink areas here. So it's number one, it's awareness, it's risk assessment, and it's control. And we'll talk about control in a minute.
Yep. So if you're out on the farm and you see a few trees, large or small, what should you be doing about it? What sort of control techniques are feasible, Nick?
Well, there's a lot, and I know you and your little pack, Miles, carry around one of these, little wee silky jackknife saw, superb little tool that. And I know the musterers on Molesworth Station now carry these. So being aware of wildings, they see one like that, and they'll get out with that little saw and use it. But we've got this wilding prevention booklet, and we've just produced the next grade up, which is this one here, the wilding control. And inside there, if you hold that, is actually a picture of our photographer right there, but if you hold, whoops, no, we'll go back to this one here. If you hold that open, up across here we've got wilding control toolbox. So these are all the various tools that could be used for wilding control. Burning, grazing, fertilising, hand pulling, tools, loppers, etc., like that little saw here, ring barking, chainsaw, scrub bar, mulcher, digger dozer, and then chemicals. So there's a whole lot of tools there, and certain trees, certain densities, certain heights, these tools are better. So this is designed for a farmer. When you get that bit of land of yours, Miles, you can look up in here and sort out which tool is best for controlling wildings on your place. So that's that booklet there, which will be on our website. And while I've got this up here, I'll just mention that for this sort of material and for anything to do with wildings, we have a very good website, and that is www.wildingconifers.org.nz, proving extremely popular, the only wilding website in the world, I guess. And that's one of our major awareness tools.
Nick, quite often when I'm hearing people controlling conifers, they talk about this little thing called no green needles. What on earth does that mean?
What that What that means is that it's very common. I don't have to use this prop again, I don't think. You've got your secateurs here? No, you haven't. No. So if you just hold that in there, just hold that in, Miles, and we'll pretend we're getting rid of this thing. So there it is, and perhaps there's grass up to this height, and we've got a little loppers, and we've come along, and it's nice and convenient to lean down and chop that off there. That is a waste of time. Within 1 year, all these will have stood up, and they're starting to grow. You can just leave one piece on that stump like that, and it will grow. So that's why they say no green needles. You have to remove all the green needles from the base. They can't come away then, but if you leave any green needles, they can come away.
Now, when I go up in the high country, sometimes I see a few wilding trees, and I sort of wave a fist at them from time to time, but as often as not, you might come around a corner and you'll see 200 or 300 hectares of neat little rows of pine trees planted up and down the hillside. I'm seeing forestry here that someone's paid a lot of money for to put in, and then over here there's wilding trees coming up. seems to be trees for free, and it could almost be forestry for free.
Yeah, that's true. Trees are going to be an integral part of our future, whether we like it or not. They've got an enormous lot of good aspects to them, whether it be for soil erosion or biomass production or shelter, etc., etc. And wilding trees are the element that we don't want. But if they spread, you say, okay, you've got a forest for nothing. But the trouble is, it's often the wrong species, i.e. this is not a very commercial species. It's on the wrong site, it might be difficult to access. There's a range of different densities. They're thick there, they're thin here. The form is often poor. They've got big taper because they're grown in the open, big branches. So really you've got a typical wild crop. And that's, for example, why we farm deer. Wild deer are not worth nearly as much as farm deer. Same with wildings.
So, Nick, you've certainly shown us what the problem we've got. What do you see the future being for wilding trees?
Well, actually, I'm very positive about the future as far as wilding control is concerned. What we're doing now, we're trying to fix problems which for 100 years we just didn't really recognise. And in some cases, almost the horse has bolted, such as where we're going tomorrow. It's a hard job. But for a lot of other areas, we're now aware of it. So we're going to get people practicing carrying these things around and removing these things stitch in time, saving 9. And in addition, the tree that we're going to look at tomorrow is this one, and the remnants of that one we just chopped up. That species is another one there. This is contorta pine, that was Corsican pine. This one here is Scots pine. Nobody's planting those these days. So some of those major spreading species, nobody's planting them. They're just not commercially worth it. So we're not going to see new areas, and once we're on top of the existing lot, which we've ignored for 100 years, it'll largely be I'll be out of a job in 20 years, I'll be well retired, but there won't be such a wilding problem at that time. So I've got very positive about that future.
Yep. Oh, well, thanks, Nick. I guess most people that have come to Ellerslie Flower Show will be thinking very much about planting trees rather than getting rid of trees. But of course, whenever we plant something, there's the chance that they're going to reproduce and that their progeny could become problematic. I suppose what you've shown us, that every tree can have side effects, but at the same time, by looking and studying the dynamics of the trees, you've shown that you're able to really model what's going to happen. You can actually tell what's going to happen ahead of it, and if you get in time and take the appropriate action, then it is indeed manageable.
Oh, indeed. I'm a great advocate of trees. I plant a lot of trees, and it's just the right tree in the right place. And wildings is one aspect we weren't familiar with. We are now. So I'm sure in the future it won't be looked upon anywhere near the problem that it is now.
Very good. Thanks, Nick.